He hadn't kissed anyone in 12 years, and when he finally did, it was by accident. A wealthy CEO, still grieving the loss of his wife, finds himself at a company anniversary party surrounded by people, but utterly alone. Then the lights go out. In that moment of darkness, guided by a familiar perfume and the warmth of a presence, he kisses a woman he believes he knows. But when the lights return, he realizes he kissed his secretary, the woman who has worked beside him for 9 quiet years, never once crossing the line. What would you do if a single moment broke through years of silence, if one mistake cracked open the door to something your heart had long stopped asking for? This is not a story about passion. It's a story about rediscovery, about 2 people who thought life had passed them by, until life gently whispered, "Not yet." If this touched your heart, leave a comment below and let us know what moment changed you. And now let us take you back to the beginning, to the night of the kiss that changed everything. He hadn't kissed anyone in 12 years, but on that cold December night, in the flickering dark of a hotel ballroom, Nathaniel Alden kissed a stranger, and the moment the lights came back on, his world shifted forever. Nathaniel Alden stood near the edge of the crowd, one hand resting in the pocket of his tailored charcoal suit, the other wrapped around a glass of untouched champagne. From his quiet vantage point, he watched as the ballroom swirled with people colleagues, partners, longtime employees who had built Alden Interiors from a 2-room workshop into a national design empire. The chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting soft gold light across polished floors and sequined dresses. He should have felt proud, but instead, a familiar ache settled in his chest, a hollow sort of quiet that had become all too common these past 12 years. 12 Christmases without her. Maggie had died in early winter, when the maple trees still held the last of their leaves and the snow hadn't yet arrived to cover the world in silence. Since then, Nate had thrown himself into his work with near-military discipline. He built factories, opened showrooms, streamlined departments, and acquired competitors with a calm, ruthless precision. But there were things success could not mend, things no amount of wood, steel, or polished marble could fill. "Mr. Alden," a soft voice said at his elbow. He turned slightly to see Claire Bennett standing beside him, tablet in hand. Her navy dress was modest but elegant, fitting her like it had been made just for her. Her chestnut hair was pinned back in an understated bun, a few soft wisps curling around her cheeks. Claire had worked for him for 9 years. She was efficient, unshakable, and always knew where he needed to be before he did. She rarely joined in the company's celebrations beyond what was required, preferring to stay at the edges, managing logistics from her phone like a quiet conductor. "The catering staff asked if we can approve extra servings of the bourbon bread pudding," she said, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Apparently it's a hit." Nate nodded. "Approved. Make sure they bill us for it." Claire tapped her tablet. "Done." And just like that, she disappeared back into the crowd, swallowed by sequins and chatter. Nate watched her go, realizing not for the first time that he knew so little about the woman who had kept his life running with such quiet devotion. Moments later, the lights flickered once. Then again, a hush fell over the room. The orchestra stumbled to a stop. Then, with a loud click, the chandeliers above went dark. The ballroom plunged into shadow, save for a few emergency sconces casting amber glows near the exits. There was a collective murmur of surprise, followed by laughter. Someone near the stage shouted, "Romantic, isn't it?" And the string quartet, ever professional, resumed playing, this time something softer, sweeter. Couples chuckled and leaned into one another. In the dimness, identities blurred, movement slowed, shadows shifted like memory. Nate exhaled. The darkness cloaked him in something almost peaceful. He closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. A waltz. Maggie had loved waltzes. He turned, almost instinctively, drawn toward a quiet corner where a few guests stood chatting, their faces half lit. And then he saw her. A woman in navy. Alone. Graceful. familiar in a way that sent a tremor down his spine. He didn't think. His body moved before logic could catch up. He reached gently for her hand. She startled slightly but didn't pull away. He stepped closer, guided by a memory more than sight. And then, without a word, he bent his head and pressed a kiss soft, warm, tentative against her lips. It was a moment, barely a breath. But in that breath, something in him cracked open. Her hand gripped his for half a second longer than necessary. Then snap. The chandeliers flared back to life, and everything changed. She was looking up at him with wide, stunned eyes. Claire, his assistant, the woman he had just kissed. They both froze. Nate's breath caught. Her lips were still parted, her cheeks blooming with heat. For a second, neither spoke. Around them, the ballroom returned to its usual rhythm, people laughing, clinking glasses, pretending nothing had happened. But between them, everything had... Claire blinked, then stepped back. I should check on the kitchen, she said quickly, voice tight. She turned before he could answer, disappearing through a side door. Nate stood in the center of the room, rooted to the spot. The champagne in his hand had grown warm. The music played on, but it no longer filled the space the same way. He had kissed someone, for the first time in 12 years. And it had been Claire. He brought a hand to his mouth, as if to catch the moment before it fled. It had been a mistake, a moment of confusion, shadow, and memory. And yet, why did it feel like something far more than that? There are many kinds of silence, the kind that's comforting and the kind that screams. For Nate and Claire, the silence that followed the kiss was deafening. Monday morning came with its usual chill. Outside the Alden Interiors building, the wind rattled through bare branches, sending dried leaves skittering across the stone plaza like forgotten thoughts. Inside, the elevators hummed, polished shoes clicked across marble floors, and the usual Monday bustle filled the hallways except in one office on the 19th floor, where everything felt unusually still. Nathaniel Alden sat behind his desk, a cup of untouched coffee cooling beside him, staring absently through the frosted glass wall that separated his office from the open floor. Claire's desk, always neatly arranged, always punctual, was empty. She hadn't called in sick, hadn't sent a message, just didn't come in. At 9:12, her name popped up in his inbox. Subject PTO request, 4 days, no explanation. He stared at the email for a long time, rereading the words that weren't there. No greeting, no hope your day is going well, no warm sign-off, just the standard request, typed with surgical precision as if she'd copied it from the HR handbook, detached, cold. He approved it, of course, immediately. He always trusted her to manage her time, but that didn't stop the ache that settled low in his chest, like a dull weight pressing against something he'd only just started to feel again. Tuesday was worse. Claire had always been a quiet presence, never loud, never seeking the spotlight, but now, her absence echoed louder than any raised voice. The usual rhythm of the office was off. Nate noticed every small thing. His calendar, normally filtered through her intuitive rearranging, felt clunky and abrupt. Meetings felt longer. The coffee in his travel mug had the wrong ratio of cream to sugar. Even the lights in the conference room felt too bright. But mostly, it was the chair. That chair, the one just to his right during every strategy meeting, every investor call, every impromptu lunch debrief. Now it sat empty, perfectly still. And somehow, that silence shouted louder than any argument could have. Nate found himself looking toward it more than once, half expecting her to be there, to glance up from her notes with that steady calm she carried, offering the right word at the right time. Or even a soft smile, one of the rare ones, the ones she only gave when no one else was looking. But she wasn't there, and he didn't know how to reach her, not without breaking the very boundary he had crossed in a moment of confused emotion and flickering light. By Wednesday, Nate had started avoiding the executive floor lounge entirely. It reminded him of the hotel ballroom of the kiss, of the way her breath had caught, the way she had looked at him when the lights came back on, not angry, not cold, just surprised, deeply, quietly surprised, and then she had left, without a word. He hadn't followed. He didn't know how to follow. It would have been easier if she had confronted him, if she had been furious, demanded an explanation, shouted at him for overstepping. But Claire didn't shout. She disappeared. And now, all he had was silence. Thursday afternoon, Nate canceled his last meeting of the day and closed the blinds in his office. The winter light outside was fading, turning the sky a smoky blue that reminded him of dusk in upstate New York, where he and Maggie used to spend weekends by the lake. He hadn't thought about that cabin in years. He opened his laptop, drafted an email. Claire, I want to apologize for Friday night. That moment, it wasn't planned. It was a mistake. Not because it happened, but because it happened that way. In the dark, unexpected, without context. You've always meant more than your job title to this company, and to me. He stared at the blinking cursor, then backspaced, slowly. He tried again. Hi, Claire. Just wanted to check in. Hope you're doing okay. Let me know if you need anything. Too casual, too empty. He deleted that one too. Another try. Claire, if I've made you uncomfortable in any way, I'm sorry. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. But again, delete. Nothing felt right, because the truth was, he didn't know what he wanted to say. He didn't even fully understand what he was feeling. The kiss had been real, soft, brief, but real. It had stirred something in him he thought had long since gone quiet, a longing he didn't yet have words for. But perhaps Claire didn't feel the same. Perhaps, for her, it had been a line crossed, and the silence was her answer. He shut the laptop. The room was darker now, quieter. He glanced at the chair again, still empty, still waiting. And for the first time in a long time, Nathaniel Alden felt unsure, sometimes to face the truth. You need to step away from the noise. That's what Nate thought when he invited Claire to the lake house. A quiet place might soften the tension, maybe even help him understand what he still couldn't name. It had been 4 days since Claire walked out of the ballroom without a word. 4 days since that brief, mistaken kiss in the dark. 4 days of quiet that said too much. When Claire returned to the office on Monday morning, she looked rested but distant. She wore a deep green sweater, her hair loosely pulled back, and her usual calm was in place, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. Nate, unsure of how to bridge the gap between them, defaulted to structure, control, routine. We're behind on the end-of-year transition documents, he told her, not looking up from his calendar. I was thinking, we could work through it over a few days at the cabin. Claire blinked, caught off guard. The lake house, she asked, cautiously. Yes. Quiet. No meetings, no distractions. Just finishing things. He didn't say, and maybe talking. He couldn't. She hesitated just a moment too long, but then nodded. All right, she said simply. If that's what's needed. The drive north was quiet. Early snow had blanketed the countryside in soft white, and the sky had the stillness only December could offer. Nate kept his eyes on the road. Claire looked out the window, watching the trees pass like silent sentinels. The lake house, built of pine and stone, sat at the water's edge like a forgotten hymn. Nate hadn't been back in nearly 2 years. Not since the last winter he'd come alone, trying to write out a speech and ending up staring at the frozen water for 3 days straight. It had once been a happy place. He opened the door and let Claire walk in first. The scent of wood, dust, and something faintly floral hung in the air. Old books lined the shelves. The fireplace stood cold and empty. And on the mantel, framed in wood, was a photo of a smiling woman with soft gray eyes. Claire noticed it immediately. She didn't say a word. Nate followed her gaze. Her name was Evelyn, he said, quietly. We built this place together. Spent almost every New Year's here? Claire turned to him slowly, her voice gentle. I know. You mentioned her. Once. He nodded. We thought we had more time. Silence again. But this time, it didn't scream. It just lingered. Grief had its own vocabulary. They settled into a quiet routine. Nate worked at the oak table in the great room, laptop open, eyes often staring off at the lake. Claire took the guest room, made coffee each morning, and kept to her lists. They spoke only when necessary, until Wednesday afternoon. Claire had gone into the kitchen to look for a pan. She opened a drawer too quickly, and a photo album slid off the shelf above the counter, falling open on the floor. She bent to pick it up and stopped. A photo had slipped loose. It was Evelyn again, younger this time, laughing, holding a bowl of dough, flour smudged on her nose. Nate, beside her, was covered in the same flour. They were making cookies. Claire didn't move. She just looked at the image like it held a language she hadn't learned yet. Nate entered behind her and saw the scene. She loved to bake, he said, his voice lower than usual. Even when she got sick, especially then. Claire held the photo delicately. She looks full of life. She was. He paused. It's strange. Sometimes I can still hear her humming, and sometimes I can't remember her voice at all. He rubbed the back of his neck, then let the silence do the rest. Claire placed the photo back inside the album and set it on the counter. Loss, she said quietly, isn't something you get over. You just learn to carry it. Nate nodded, not trusting himself to speak. That night, Claire made dinner. Nothing complicated: rosemary chicken with roasted carrots and a wild rice pilaf. She moved around the kitchen like she had done it 100 times, though Nate had never seen her cook before. She wore a soft blue cardigan and tied her hair back with a velvet ribbon. When she called him to the table, he came without a word. The meal was warm, fragrant, simple. Nate took a bite and looked down for a long while. I'd forgotten, he said softly, how comforting home-cooked food can be. Claire smiled just slightly. Sometimes, she replied, quiet meals can say the things we're too afraid to. They ate in near silence, but it wasn't heavy, it wasn't empty, it was peaceful. Nate hadn't felt that in years, and as the snow began to fall again outside, blanketing the lake in soft stillness, something in him started to settle. Healing doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes, it slips in with the smell of coffee and the sound of silence shared. The mornings at the lake house moved slowly, like honey on a spoon. Outside, the frozen lake sat untouched beneath a blanket of snow, the trees still and silent like a congregation waiting for a hymn. Inside, warmth gathered in corners rising from the crackling hearth, seeping from mugs filled with dark roast, and lingering in the quiet between two people who didn't quite know how to be together again. Nathaniel woke first. Always had. Even after retirement from the constant hum of CEO life, his body still obeyed the rhythm of early mornings. By the time the sky hinted at light behind thick curtains, he'd already put the kettle on, fed the 2 fat squirrels that kept showing up near the porch, and made enough noise in the kitchen to be polite but not enough to wake her. Claire usually emerged just after the first pour. She never looked rushed, wrapped in a long knitted cardigan, her hair loose and soft at her shoulders. She carried the quiet confidence of someone who knew how to move gently through a day. They didn't talk much at first, just 2 mugs steaming between them, books half read on their laps, the occasional turning of a page or shifting in a seat. The silence wasn't awkward, it was intentional, and slowly, morning after morning, it became familiar, then comforting, then something they both quietly looked forward to. On the 3rd day, Claire found something new at her usual spot, a worn paperback with a faded cover and a folded note tucked inside. A man called Ove. He reminded me of someone, grumpy on the outside, soft center. N. Claire smiled before she realized it. The kind that reaches the eyes and disappears just as quickly. She held the book in her hands like a gift she hadn't known she needed. She took her seat by the window. Nate sat across from her, legs crossed, reading glasses perched on his nose as he worked his way through a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt. They didn't speak, but the air had shifted. Later that afternoon, Claire stood by the bay window, arms crossed, watching the sky darken earlier than expected. The sun had barely touched the horizon, and already dusk pressed against the panes. She spoke quietly, almost to herself. You ever notice how snow makes everything feel softer? Nate glanced up from his notes, like a hush falls over the world. Claire nodded. When I was little, I used to pretend snow was the sky's way of telling us to slow down. He smiled. You were a poetic kid. I was, she admitted, used to write and paint. That last word came out so unexpectedly she almost winced hearing it. Nate closed his notebook. You painted. Claire kept her eyes on the falling snow. Yes, watercolors, oils too, when I could afford them. Mostly portraits and little things. People at coffee shops, landscapes out my bedroom window. He didn't press. She finally turned toward him. I stopped around 32, packed it all away when life needed to be practical. Nate understood that kind of decision. His own dreams playing piano, learning to build furniture, taking road trips with Evelyn had been buried under decades of meetings, stock reports, and shareholder pressure. What made you stop? He asked gently. Claire gave a small shrug. I got married. He didn't think painting was realistic. I got a job, paid the bills. Then came the divorce. After that, it just felt far away, like it belonged to someone I used to be. She looked down at her hands, fingers now used to typing emails and writing schedules, not holding brushes. I haven't painted in 20 years. The number sat between them like a guest neither had invited. Nate stood without a word and disappeared into the hallway. When he returned, he was holding a small, leather-bound sketch pad and a tin box of charcoal pencils. He offered them without flourish, placing them gently in her lap. Found them in Evelyn's writing desk. She used to write letters she never sent. He gave a soft chuckle, a whole drawer full of them. Claire opened the sketch pad. The pages were thick, the kind that welcome mistakes and second chances. Maybe, Nate said, looking at her steadily. It's time. She traced a fingertip over the first blank page. Her throat tightened. I wouldn't know where to start. You don't need to, he said. Just begin. That night, Claire made her grandmother's tomato stew rich, slow-cooked, laced with thyme. Nate opened a bottle of red from a vineyard he used to visit with Evelyn. They ate slowly, savoring flavors and silences. Nate complimented the food. Claire deflected. He told her again. This time, she smiled without looking down. After the dishes were cleared and the fire re-stoked, Claire lingered in the study with the sketch pad. She didn't draw, not yet, but she flipped through a few pages, tapped the pencil absently, let the muscle memory return in bits and pieces. Nate watched from the armchair, reading glasses abandoned, book closed in his lap. He didn't say a word, but he didn't look away, either. It wasn't the cold that knocked her down. It was the sudden rush of memories and the fear of what she was starting to feel. The wind outside had picked up, whistling low through the pine trees like an old song no one remembered the words to. Inside the lake house, the fire burned steady. A pot of soup simmered softly on the stove, and the scent of rosemary and garlic warmed the air. Claire stood at the kitchen counter, peeling carrots for the evening stew. She moved slowly, methodically, her thoughts still lingering on the sketch pad she'd held the night before. The blank pages had stirred something in her, a quiet ache for the person she used to be, the part of her that painted sunlight through lace curtains and the curve of a stranger's smile in a cafe window. That part hadn't died. It had only been buried. She set the knife down, gripped the edge of the counter. The warmth drained from her fingertips. Her vision blurred. The room tilted just slightly at first, then all at once. She reached out, but the world slipped. When Nate found her, she was lying on the kitchen floor, one hand still loosely curled around the dish towel she'd been holding. Her skin was pale, her breath shallow. Claire. He was at her side in seconds, his pulse thudding in his ears louder than the storm now rattling the windows. Claire, hey, hey, look at me. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused. I'm fine, she whispered, but she wasn't. He knew that voice steady even in distress, trained to minimize everything. The voice of a woman used to taking care of others, never allowing herself to be cared for. Nate slid one arm under her knees, the other behind her back, and lifted her carefully. She was lighter than he expected. You're not fine, he said gently, his voice more firm than it had been in years. He carried her to the guest room and laid her down with care, pulling the quilt over her body before disappearing into the kitchen to grab a wet cloth and a glass of water. His hands moved with quiet urgency, controlled, but trembling slightly. When he returned, she was awake, but weak. Low blood pressure, she murmured. It happens sometimes. I didn't eat much today. He handed her the water. You scared me, he said. She looked up at him, surprised by the honesty in his voice. I didn't mean to. I know. Silence settled again, but it felt different this time. Not awkward, not cold, just still like something between them had shifted and neither of them wanted to name it yet. Nate stayed by her side that evening. He brought her tea, fluffed the pillow behind her back, and sat in the armchair across the room while she rested. Occasionally, their eyes met and lingered a little longer than necessary. He didn't return to his laptop. He didn't check his phone. He just stayed. Around 9, Claire stirred and looked toward him. You don't have to sit there all night. I want to. Her brow furrowed slightly. Why? He hesitated, then stood slowly and walked over to the edge of the bed. He didn't sit, not yet just looked down at her, hands in the pockets of his cardigan. Because I haven't felt this. He paused, searching for the right word. Connected. In a very long time. Claire's breath caught. She looked away. He sat then, on the edge of the bed, careful to keep a respectful distance. I don't know what this is, he said, and I'm not asking for anything. But I do know that when I saw you on that floor, something in me cracked open. Claire turned to face him again. I felt it too, she whispered. Not just tonight, not just the kiss. He reached out then, not with urgency, not to claim, but gently. Just the brush of his fingertips against the back of her hand. It was the kind of touch that asked permission, and she didn't pull away. They stayed like that for a long time, hands resting lightly between them. The room silent except for the wind outside and the soft creak of old wood settling. Claire didn't sleep deeply that night. Dreams hovered just beyond reach, memories of her old art studio, of mornings with paint-stained fingers, and the quiet way her husband had once looked at her. Before he'd stopped seeing her altogether, she woke before dawn. The sky outside the window was still dark, a thin layer of frost creeping across the panes. She rose slowly, walked to the small bathroom, and turned on the light. The woman in the mirror looked tired, but not hollow. Her cheeks held color again. Her eyes seemed brighter, though unsure. There was something in her gaze she hadn't seen in years. Softness. Maybe. Or hope. She studied her own reflection, fingers brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. And then, quietly, she asked herself the question that had been rising all along. What am I becoming to him when words are too heavy to speak? They find shelter on paper. But even then, not all letters are meant to be read. The morning after Claire fainted, the world outside had softened. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clean hush of snow that coated the cabin roof, the pines, and the frozen lake in a kind of quiet grace. Inside, the air was warm again, not just from the firewood Nate had stacked at dawn, but from something else, something more difficult to name. They moved around each other gently, with a new softness. No declarations, no questions, just gestures, refills of tea, a touch at the elbow, a lingering look that held just a second longer than before. But inside Nate, the words began to gather. They always did, eventually. He waited until Claire was out on a short walk, her strength still not fully returned, but her stubbornness stronger than any advice to rest. In the study, Nate sat at Evelyn's old writing desk, the one that still smelled faintly of lavender and cedar. The desk had 3 drawers, one locked, one stuck, and one that always creaked when opened. He chose the creaky one, tugged it out with care, and pulled a sheet of stationery from the back, a deep breath, then another, and he began to write. Claire, that night in the ballroom, when I kissed you in the dark, I thought I had made a mistake. I didn't realize until days later that it wasn't the kiss that surprised me. It was what I felt in that moment, something I hadn't felt in 12 years, something alive. I know what lines we're supposed to draw. I know what roles we've lived in for nearly a decade, you as the anchor of my chaos, me as the man who always pretended to have everything under control. But that kiss, it reminded me I'm still here, still capable of feeling, still human. And maybe, if I'm honest, I want to know who I am when I'm with you, but I also know I have no right to ask. Not yet. Maybe not ever. So, this letter stays here, folded between paper and wood, instead of being placed in your hand, because I care enough not to rush you. N. He stared at the page for a long while after the ink dried. Then, with hands that didn't quite feel steady, he folded the letter into thirds and placed it inside an unused envelope. He didn't seal it. Instead, he slipped it quietly into the desk drawer, beneath a small stack of unused stationery, tucked far enough back that it wouldn't be seen unless someone was looking. Then he closed the drawer, and with it, the part of himself that still wasn't ready. Claire returned shortly after, cheeks pink from the cold, eyes brighter than they had been in months. I walked to the edge of the lake, she said, peeling off her gloves, could see the snow forming tiny crystals on the branches. It looked like glass. Nate smiled. Glad you're back. He meant more than just the walk. Later that afternoon, Claire sat by the window with the sketch pad open on her lap. Her fingers moved with growing certainty, the lines of her drawing no longer tentative or cautious. She'd started the sketch that morning. What began as a still life of the kitchen table had evolved into something else entirely. It was a view from the cabin window, the lake in winter, the outline of pine trees in the distance. But in the foreground, faintly visible in pencil strokes and soft charcoal, were 2 mugs on a wooden sill, steam rising, a suggestion of 2 shadows seated nearby. She didn't know why she added them, only that it felt true. By evening, the drawing was finished. She didn't show it to Nate, not yet. She wasn't sure if it was ready or if she was. Instead, she placed it in the back of the sketch pad, tucked beneath the cover, and laid the pad gently on the writing desk, where he often worked. I'll start another tomorrow, she said aloud to no one. And then, with no real plan, she began tidying the room, dusting bookshelves, stacking spare blankets, arranging the pens that had accumulated across the desk. She reached for the bottom drawer to organize the unused paper. It creaked, and there, half tucked beneath a stack of stationery, was an envelope. Her fingers hesitated. It had no name, no seal, but the paper inside was slightly curled, as if it had been read then hidden. She pulled it out, stared, and didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, she held it in both hands, breathing in quietly, heart tapping a rhythm she couldn't slow. She looked toward the window, where the light had begun to dim again, casting long shadows on the floor. The cabin felt still, expectant. She didn't know what the letter would say, but she knew deep in her chest that whatever it held was meant for her. Love is terrifying, not because it hurts, but because it heals. And sometimes, healing feels more frightening than pain. Claire didn't sleep that night. The letter lay folded on her lap for hours after she found it. She had read it once in silence, then again, slower this time, each word echoing like footsteps down a long hallway inside her chest. She sat cross-legged on the floor by the fireplace, wrapped in the old knitted shawl she'd found in the guest room, hands trembling slightly as they rested over the envelope. The fire had burned low, casting shifting shadows across the room, But she hadn't noticed the cold creeping in. The letter was many things unexpected, tender, cautious. But more than anything, it was honest. And that honesty undid her. It wasn't the kiss that surprised me. It was what I felt in that moment. Something I hadn't felt in 12 years. It wasn't a declaration, not a plea, just a quiet truth laid bare on paper. And she didn't know what to do with it. Claire had lived most of her adult life inside carefully drawn lines. Expectations, responsibilities, silence. She had been someone's wife, someone's employee, someone's "you're so reliable." The idea of being wanted not for her efficiency or her steadiness, but for her presence, for her essence. It overwhelmed her. She was grateful, deeply, moved, deeply, but she was also scared. What if this warmth she was beginning to feel wasn't love, but loneliness? What if it was a passing tenderness born from shared grief and winter stillness? What if they mistook comfort for connection? And perhaps most haunting of all, what if it was real, and she couldn't carry it? At some point near dawn, she stood, folded the letter gently, and placed it back on the desk where he'd left it. She found a small piece of notepaper in the drawer, tore off a corner, and wrote, "Thank you. I needed to feel again." She left it beside the letter. Then, quietly, deliberately, she began to pack. Nate woke to silence. Not the soft, shared kind they had grown used to, but the kind that felt empty, stretched thin, unfinished. There was no coffee brewing, no teacup on the windowsill, no slow shuffle of slippers on hardwood floors. He checked the guest room. Empty. Her bags gone. The pillow on her bed still held the shape of her head. He walked to the study and saw the writing desk left slightly ajar. His letter was there, opened, smoothed, read, beside it, her note, 2 short lines. "Thank you. I needed to feel again." He read it twice, and then a third time. The tightness in his chest didn't come from shock. Deep down, he had known she might leave. She was not a woman who ran, but she was one who retreated when unsure. That was the kind of strength she carried. Quiet, graceful, self-protective. He sat at the edge of the desk and let the stillness wash over him. Outside, the lake was motionless, its surface glazed in a fragile layer of ice that caught the morning light like broken glass. He walked out without a coat, his boots crunching through snow as he followed the familiar path toward the dock. The cold bit at his face, but he didn't feel it. At the edge of the water, he stopped, looked out across the vast white, and something inside him broke. The tears came suddenly, at first, just one, then another, until he was weeping not in quiet restraint, but with a full-bodied sorrow he hadn't allowed himself in years. Not even when Evelyn died, not even when the house felt like a museum of memories and unsaid words. He cried for everything he'd buried, for the loneliness that had become so familiar he'd stopped noticing its weight, for the woman who'd sat across from him in quiet mornings, unknowingly awakening something he thought was long gone. He cried because the letter had been read, and she had left anyway. When the tears subsided, he sat on the dock, rubbing his eyes with cold, reddened fingers. The sky had turned pale gold at the edges. A new day was beginning, but it didn't feel like a return to anything. It felt like something had changed, maybe not lost, but shifted, and he couldn't go back to who he was before. Back inside the cabin, Nate moved slowly, methodically, as if his body had to relearn motion. He cleaned the dishes from the night before, folded the blanket on the couch, set 2 mugs side by side out of habit, and then quietly placed one back on the shelf. Then, without really thinking, his hands began gathering ingredients from the pantry: flour, molasses, ginger, cinnamon. The gingerbread recipe Evelyn had once sworn would fix any sadness that fit on a spoon. He hadn't made it in over a decade, but now his fingers remembered the rhythm, the mixing, the kneading, the shaping. As the smell filled the kitchen warm, earthy, familiar, Nate felt something settle deep in his chest. Food had always spoken where words failed. Evelyn believed that. Claire, too. He let the cookies cool, then packed them gently into a small tin box he found in the cupboard, lined it with a clean towel, and on top, he tucked the recipe card, handwritten in Evelyn's looping script. Then he zipped his coat, picked up his bag, and stepped out into the crisp air. Claire had once told him where she lived, just north of Portland, a little town where people still wave to each other. He didn't know her address, but he had time. He had cookies, and he had something he still hadn't said, not out loud. But maybe, finally, he was ready. He never liked Christmas after she passed. But that year, he found himself knocking on a door with a tin of ginger cookies and a heart too full to carry alone. Snow had fallen steadily the entire drive, thick, quiet flakes that blurred the lines of the road and turned trees into silhouettes of stillness. Nate gripped the steering wheel tighter than he needed to, not because of the weather, but because of what waited at the end of the road. He had no address, just a name of a town, and the kind of faith that had taken years to grow back. The streets were quiet. A string of white lights hung gently across porches, windows framed with soft garlands. The kind of place where mailboxes still wore scarves in December, and no one was in too much of a hurry to smile. He stopped at a corner cafe, stepped inside to warm his hands, and asked a woman behind the counter if she knew a Claire Bennett. She looked up from the register, smiled. Claire with the sketchbooks? Nate exhaled. Yes. She lives 2 streets over. Yellow house, blue shutters, big front porch. He thanked her, heart pacing faster than his feet as he stepped back out into the cold. He stood on her porch longer than he meant to. The house was quiet. A soft wreath hung on the door. Through the window, he saw the flicker of firelight, the curve of a lamp's glow, the edge of a painting leaning against the wall. The tin of gingerbread in his hands felt heavier than it should. So did everything else. He raised his hand, knocked twice, then waited. Claire opened the door without checking the peephole. She wore a thick cardigan over flannel, hair loosely braided, cheeks flushed from the warmth inside. When she saw him, her mouth parted slightly but no words came. They stood there for a breath. 2, maybe more. Nate cleared his throat. I brought cookies. That made her smile. A real one, laced with disbelief and something softer. She stepped aside, held the door open with one hand. You'd better come in. They'll go stale in this wind. The house smelled like pine and citrus, like someone had simmered oranges and cinnamon on the stove all morning. A small tree stood in the corner, unevenly decorated, with a handmade star at the top. Claire led him into the living room, where the fireplace crackled low. A teapot sat on the coffee table, 2 mugs beside it, as if she had been expecting someone, and maybe, in a way, she sat first. He followed. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The only sound was the shifting of logs in the hearth. Then she looked at him, more steady now. You drove all this way. He nodded. Didn't want to wonder for another year what might have happened if I hadn't. She reached for the teapot, poured 2 cups without asking. The steam curled between them like breath. He took his with both hands, let the warmth soak into his palms before speaking. I wasn't sure if you'd want to see me. I wasn't sure either, she said quietly. But I'm glad I do. That made something loosen in his chest. They sat in silence again, but it was a different silence now. One filled with memory and possibility, not absence. Claire glanced toward the tin on the table. You made these, I did, Nate said. First time in 12 years. For me, he met her eyes. Because of you. She looked down, tracing the rim of her teacup with her finger. The flickering light danced across her face, highlighting the fine lines at her temples, the curve of thought between her brows. I read your letter, she said. I know. Claire nodded, lips parted but uncertain. Then, with a quiet inhale, she said, it was beautiful and terrifying and true. He leaned forward, resting his hands on his knees. I don't want to pretend anymore. Her eyes flicked up, meeting his. I spent too many years pretending I was fine. That silence was safer. That nothing hurt because I refused to feel it. But the truth is, I've been lonely. Claire, and the days here with you, they were the first ones that didn't feel hollow. Her throat tightened. She hadn't prepared for this, not for the steadiness in his voice, not for the way it made her chest ache. She whispered, "Neither do I." For a moment, nothing moved. Then she reached out. Not fast, not sudden, just a quiet, deliberate gesture. Her fingers slid over his, rested there. A touch not of desperation, but of choosing. Not "I love you," not yet, but something that lived in the same house. Stay. They didn't speak much after that. The fire needed tending. The cookies were opened. They sat together on the couch, legs not quite touching, mugs warming their hands while the snow continued to fall softly outside. Claire glanced toward him as he looked at the tree. "I didn't decorate the top half," she said. "Too short." He smiled. "I'll take care of that tomorrow." It wasn't a plan, it was a promise. Love, at this age, isn't about grand gestures. It's about choosing each other over and over, even in the quiet. The cabin became a rhythm, not a retreat, not an escape, just a place where time softened, where mornings began with the sound of birdsong and the scent of fresh coffee, and where no one needed to ask for permission to simply be. Claire had moved slowly into the space, bringing little things at first: her sketch pad, her favorite tea, a wool blanket she'd knitted in her 30s. Nate made no demands, offered no timelines, only space and warmth. By that winter's end, there were 2 toothbrushes in the drawer, 2 pairs of slippers by the door, 2 lives, carefully lived, now quietly braided together. They never spoke of marriage. They didn't need to. In early spring, Nate surprised Claire with a proposal she never saw, coming not one with a ring, but with a folder. Inside were the documents for a new nonprofit foundation, the Bennett Alden Arts Fund. Its mission was simple support, local artists, particularly women over 40 who had once dreamed in color but had traded in their brushes for paychecks, parenting, or the pressing weight of reality. Claire had stared at the folder in silence, hand pressed to her chest. "You once told me," Nate said, "that painting had belonged to someone you used to be. I think it still belongs to who you are now, and I want others to find their way back too." Tears had sprung to her eyes. She nodded, couldn't speak, just reached across the table and squeezed his hand. By summer, Claire was teaching again, but not in a school. She ran weekly workshops in the back room of a bookstore, where the windows overlooked a tiny garden and the walls smelled of old paper and lavender oil. Her students were women with laugh lines, reading glasses, and hands that trembled at first when they held a brush. They painted wildflowers, their childhood homes, portraits of people they hadn't seen in decades. And in the quiet moments between brushstrokes, they told stories about love that had faded, love that had endured, and the love they were learning to offer themselves again. Claire never stood at the front of the room like a teacher. She sat beside them, apron stained, fingers smudged with charcoal, reminding them gently that art wasn't about perfection. It was about presence. Nate, in his own way, had found a rhythm too. He began baking more seriously at first, just for Claire, then for neighbors, then for the town's annual charity fair. By fall, his ginger cookies had a small following, and his name was scribbled in Sharpie on the community center's sign-up sheet for every bake sale. But it wasn't the baking that grounded him. It was the way people gathered around the table after, the way conversation replaced boardroom briefings, the way laughter spilled across coffee mugs and cloth napkins, the way Claire always stood in the doorway afterward, arms crossed, watching him with a smile that said, "You didn't think you'd like this, did you?" And he never had to answer. They returned to the lake house every winter. It became their ritual, their season of stillness. No schedule, no foundation meetings, no town events. Just fireside mornings, long walks in snow-crunched silence, and dinners lit by lamplight and laughter. Sometimes they painted, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes Nate would read aloud while Claire rested her head on his shoulder, the warmth between them needing no words. It was a life without urgency, a life of choosing. One morning, as the last frost melted and the first buds pushed their way through the earth, Claire stood in the studio room Nate had built off the back of the cabin. The space had wide windows and paint-stained floorboards. It smelled of turpentine and pine. She stepped back from the canvas. The painting had taken weeks, maybe years. In a way, it showed a winter ballroom, soft lights strung above, shadows dancing across the floor. In the foreground, two figures stood facing one another. Their features were only gently defined, but the feeling between them was unmistakable recognition. Quiet astonishment, the kind of pause that becomes a beginning. In the bottom corner, she signed her name, and beneath it, in small, deliberate script, she wrote the title, The Mistake That Wasn't. That evening, as the sun dipped low over the lake, Nate brought in dinner, herb chicken, roasted carrots, a small chocolate tart she hadn't asked for but had been craving. He set the plates down and turned to see her watching him, eyes bright. "You look like you've just finished a good chapter," he said. "I did," she replied. "Want to see." He followed her into the studio, stepping quietly behind her as she pulled the cloth back from the easel. He looked at the painting for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "It wasn't a mistake," he said, "not for 1 second." Claire turned toward him, the lines of her face softened by the fading light. "I know." 5 years later, he still kissed her like it was that night in the dark, except now. There was light everywhere. The lake house hadn't changed much. Winters still came with quiet snow and creaking wood floors. Summers still brought blooming wildflowers and children's laughter echoing through the pines. But inside, everything was different now, fuller, warmer, alive in ways it had never been before. Nathaniel Alden was 73. His hands were slower now, his steps measured. But his heart felt younger than it had in decades. And the reason for that, as always, was sitting across the breakfast table, stirring her tea with that same graceful, absent-minded motion he'd watched her do for years. Claire Bennett, now 67, had silver threading her dark hair and a laugh that still caught him off guard. Her paintings lined the walls of local cafes, libraries, and one small gallery in Portland. She never signed them with flourish, just C, B in the bottom corner. But people knew, and the women she taught every week, they knew too. They'd built a life that looked nothing like the ones they'd once imagined, and yet it fit them perfectly. The Bennett Alden Arts Fund had grown into something more than a foundation. It was a community. Retired teachers, widows, former nurses, and quiet dreamers filled its studio spaces every season, painting, sculpting, sharing stories over warm cider and paint-streaked aprons. Claire taught 2 classes a week now, usually on Tuesdays and Fridays. Nate handled the paperwork, the fundraising events, and most importantly, he baked. His ginger cookies had become a symbol of comfort, passed around with tea and gratitude like something sacred. He never called himself a teacher, but to many, he was exactly that. That particular Friday in October, the air had shifted. The first real chill of fall settled into the bones of the cabin. The trees along the lake blushed with red and amber, and Nate woke early to knit. Yes, knit. He'd learned after much teasing and many failed scarves. But this one was just right. Deep green with hints of gold, soft, warm, the exact color of the pines behind Claire's studio. He packed a thermos of her favorite Earl Grey with honey, wrapped the scarf in parchment paper, and drove the short distance into town. The studio was quiet when he arrived. It was the end of class. Claire's students were cleaning brushes, chatting softly, laughing. He peeked through the window first. She was leaning over one of the canvases, offering encouragement, her voice low and kind. He waited until she stepped outside, arms folded against the breeze. She looked up and smiled when she saw him. "You always show up when I need warm hands." He handed her the tea. She smiled wider, then gently unwrapped the scarf. "Oh, Nate, I know it's not perfect. It's exactly perfect," she said, pulling it gently around her shoulders. They stood there for a moment, bathed in the gold of late afternoon. The town behind them moved slowly, cars rolling past, leaves swirling down from the trees, the smell of something sweet wafting from the bakery across the street. Then, quietly, Nate reached for her hand. His voice dropped, not out of shyness, but reverence. "Best mistake I ever made." Claire turned toward him, eyes shimmering. She squeezed his fingers, leaned in slightly, forehead resting against his. "You still say that like it was ever a mistake." He chuckled softly, lips brushing her temple. "It just took me a little while to realize it was the best thing that ever happened." Later that evening, back at the cabin, they sat by the fire with 2 cups of cider and a blanket across their laps. Photographs lined the mantel, Nate's daughter with her twin boys, Claire's goddaughter visiting from Vermont, students from the studio holding up messy paintings with proud smiles. They talked about Thanksgiving plans, about possibly hosting both families this year, about whether the firewood needed restacking before the first snow. But mostly, they sat in silence, the kind they'd grown to love. There had been no dramatic wedding, no diamond rings, no need. They had chosen each other every day, in small and faithful ways, in shared breakfasts, in quiet forgiveness, in the way Nate warmed Claire's paint water when her hands were cold, in the way she left him notes folded between the recipe books, always signed C. Love, at this age, was not about proving anything. It was about presence. As the fire dimmed, Nate turned to her, his voice almost a whisper. "You ever miss the noise, the cities, the rush, the boardrooms?" Claire looked at him, brow lifted slightly. "You ever miss pretending not to feel things?" He laughed. "Touché." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I think we made the right choice," she said. "I think we keep making it." Outside, the stars blinked on above the lake. The pines whispered in the wind. Somewhere far away, a train passed through the night, long and low and lonely, but not here, not anymore. Here. There was stillness. There was peace. And there was a man and a woman who had once kissed in the dark and spent the rest of their years walking together in the light. Sometimes, love doesn't come in youth, with fireworks and loud declarations. Sometimes, it returns quietly years later, in the form of someone who sees you as you are, not as you were. This story reminds us that it's never too late to begin again. Grief can take up residence in our hearts for years, making us believe that our best days are behind us. But healing has its own pace, and when it comes, it doesn't demand drama. It asks only for presence, for courage, for the willingness to let someone in again. Claire and Nate didn't fall in love with the idea of each other. They chose one another every day through tea and silence, through winter mornings and quiet sacrifices. It wasn't about passion, it was about peace. The greatest lesson here, that even after loss, after decades of routine, life can still surprise us. And love, in its gentlest form, can still find its way back. All it asks is that we stay open. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, or reminded you of something you've once felt, we invite you to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that heal, inspire, and connect. We're so grateful to have you here. See you in the next story.